The candle flickers, its tallow scent mingling with the smell of old parchment and the chill of the stone floor. To understand the Middle Ages is not to look at the gold of crowns, but at the contents of a wooden bowl. For the common man, history was not written in ink, but in the slow, agonizing rhythm of the stomach. In the year of our Lord 1315, in a nameless hamlet tucked between the shadow of the Ardennes and the reach of the Meuse, the sun had become a silent executioner. For 3 months, the sky remained a hard, unyielding blue, the color of a blind eye. The earth, once a dark mother, had cracked into a map of despair. Elias, the village miller whose wheels had long ceased to turn, sat upon his threshold. The silence of a watermill is a heavy thing, it is the sound of time stopping. In the absence of the roar of water and the grinding of stone, one begins to hear the smaller, more terrifying sounds, the rattling breath of a child, the dry rustle of dead stalks in the field, and the constant, internal monologue of hunger. Hunger is not a sudden blow. It is a slow colonization. It begins as a sharpness, a brief irritation of the spirit, but soon it becomes a philosophy. It simplifies the world. The complex architecture of faith, the intricacies of feudal loyalty, the tender nuances of love, all are burned away by the acid of an empty belly until only the most primal geometry remains. There is that which can be eaten, and there is that which cannot. The smell of the village had changed. Usually, it was a thick tapestry of manure, wood smoke, and the yeasty promise of rising dough. Now, it smelled only of dust and the metallic tang of dried sweat. There was no bread. The word bread had transitioned from a staple to a prayer, and finally, to a ghost. Elias remembered the taste of rye, the dark, sour, heavy heart of it. In good years, the bread was a dense companion, flavored with caraway or hidden grains of sand from the millstones that ground down one's teeth even as they sustained one's life. Now, the villagers ate bread made of desperation. They gathered the inner bark of elm trees, scraping the pale, bitter cambium to mix with ground straw and the sweepings of the granary floor. It was a food that filled the gut but left the blood thin and cold. It tasted of wood and old earth, a rehearsal for the grave. Time, in such states of isolation, loses its linear progression. When one does not know where the next meal comes from, the future ceases to exist. There is only a perpetual, agonizing now. The bells of the church still rang the hours, matins, lauds, prime, but they felt like an insult. How can one measure the time of God when the body is busy consuming itself? Elias watched a beetle crawl across the parched dirt. A few months ago, he would have ignored it. Now, his eyes tracked its movement with a clinical, predatory focus. He thought of the great chain of being, that sacred ladder of existence taught by the priests. Man was at the top, just below the angels. But as he watched the beetle, he realized that hunger is the great leveler. In the eyes of the starving, the beetle is not a lesser creature, it is a potential vessel of protein. To be free, Elias mused, is perhaps only to have the luxury of choice. When choice is gone, when the stomach dictates the movement of the hand, the soul becomes a prisoner of the flesh. He stood up, his joints creaking like the dry timber of his mill. He went inside to find his wife, Catherine. She was stirring a pot over a fire that lacked heat. Inside the water bubbled a few shriveled turnips and a handful of nettles. The scent of the nettles was green and sharp, a reminder of the wild things that continue to grow even when the crops fail. This was the pottage of the poor, a thin, watery veil thrown over the face of starvation. The salt is gone, she said without looking up. Her voice was as dry as the wind. In the Middle Ages, salt was more than a seasoning, it was the bridge between seasons. It preserved the flesh of the pig, it kept the rot at bay. Without salt, the world began to decay. Life became immediate, fleeting. You could not save anything for tomorrow. Without the ability to preserve, the concept of a future vanished. They were living in a world of the immediate present, where every bite was a finality. They sat in the dim light, the steam from the pottage rising like a spirit. They ate in silence, the wooden spoons clicking against the bowls, a lonely, rhythmic percussion. The soup was bitter, tasting of the iron in the water and the sting of the nettles. It did not satisfy, it only reminded the body of what it lacked. Outside, the sun began to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the dying fields. Elias thought of the Eucharist, the bread that becomes the body of Christ. He wondered if God knew what it was like to be made of straw and bark. He wondered if the soul, too, could starve. If death is the ultimate isolation, then hunger is its long, slow hallway. They were not yet dead, but they were no longer fully part of the living world. They were the inhabitants of the threshold, waiting for a rain that did not come, praying to a heaven that seemed as parched as the earth. As the candle guttered, leaving them in the heavy dark of the cottage, the only sound was the wind, mocking the empty mill, whispering of a winter that would find them with nothing but the memory of the taste of salt. The candle has burned lower now, and the shadows in the corner of the room seem to lean in, as if they too are listening for the sound of a harvest that never came. If the first part of this tale was about the loss of what was known, the salt, the rye, the rhythm of the mill, then this chapter is about the desperate discovery of what lies in the margins. By the late autumn of 1315, the boundary between the village and the forest had begun to dissolve. In the medieval mind, the forest was a place of demons and outlaws, a chaotic realm outside the reach of the king's law and God's grace. But hunger is a powerful secularizer. When the granaries are empty, the dark woods no longer look like a dwelling for monsters, they look like a larder. Elias walked beneath the canopy of the Ardennes, his boots sinking into a carpet of mast and rotting leaves that smelled of damp earth and fermentation. His eyes, once trained to judge the quality of wheat by its golden hue, were now sharp, restless instruments of survival. He was looking for acorns. In times of plenty, the acorn was the food of swine. To eat the food of an animal is to feel oneself slipping down the great chain of being. But Elias knew the secret alchemy required to turn the bitter nut into something that would stop the trembling in his hands. He gathered them in his tunic, their smooth, hard shells cold against his skin. Back in the dim light of his cottage, the process began, a slow, patient labor that felt like a ritual of atonement. To eat an acorn is to negotiate with bitterness. They had to be shelled, crushed, and then washed in running water for hours, sometimes days, to leach out the tannins that would otherwise grip the throat and turn the stomach. "Is it ready?" Catherine asked, her eyes fixed on the gray, mealy paste soaking in a wooden trough. "Not yet," Elias whispered. "The bitterness still holds." This was the core of their existence, waiting for the bitterness to leave. It was a metaphor for their lives. They were waiting for the bitterness of the drought to break, for the bitterness of their luck to turn. In the meantime, they ate the paste. When cooked over the fire, it formed a heavy, dense cake. It had no lightness, no joy. It tasted of the forest floor, loam, tannin, and a faint, lingering ghost of wood smoke. It stayed in the stomach like a stone, a cold weight that provided the illusion of fullness while the body continued to wither. As the village grew quieter, the social fabric began to fray. In the Middle Ages, the act of eating was the ultimate communal bond. To break bread with another was to swear a silent oath of peace. But when there is no bread to break, the oath becomes a burden. Families began to eat in secret, shielding their bowls from the sight of neighbors. The communion of the village was replaced by a series of private, desperate isolations. Elias saw the priest, Father Thomas, walking the muddy track between the hovels. The man's vestments were loose, hanging off a frame that seemed to be collapsing inward. There was no wine for the mass, and the wafers were made of the same gray dust as the villagers' cakes. "Faith is easy when the belly is full," Thomas had told Elias once, his voice a rasp. But God is found in the emptiness. He is the hunger itself. Elias turned those words over in his mind like a dry bone. If God was the hunger, then he was a demanding guest. Elias felt a strange, detached sympathy for the Creator. Perhaps, he thought, the universe was just another mill, grinding down souls until only the essential remained. The smells of the village had shifted again. There was the scent of boiled leather, old boots and belts simmered for hours in an attempt to extract some ghost of animal fat. There was the smell of scorched earth, where people had tried to roast the very roots of the grass. And through it all, the persistent, cloying scent of decay, for even the crows were too thin to properly scavenge. One evening, Catherine brought home a handful of mushrooms she had found near the base of a lightning-struck oak. They were pale, ghostly things, smelling of ozone and wet stone. They ate them roasted, the texture slippery and strange, a fleeting richness that felt like a sin. For an hour, the world felt less sharp. They sat in the dark, and for the first time in weeks, they talked not of food, but of the time they had walked to the fair at Namur, of the taste of spiced ale and the sound of a lute. But the memory was a cruelty. To remember a feast in the midst of a famine is a form of torture. It reminds the spirit of the heights from which it has fallen. "We are becoming like the trees," Catherine said softly, her hand resting on his. "Static. Deep-rooted in our misery. Waiting for a spring that might not recognize us." Elias looked at her. Her beauty had been carved away, leaving behind the essential architecture of her face, the high cheekbones, the deep-set eyes, the steady strength of her jaw. She was beautiful in the way a ruin is beautiful, the history of her endurance was written in the lines around her mouth. The freedom they had now was a terrifying one. They were free from the expectations of the harvest, free from the demands of the lord of the manor, who had fled to his estates in the south. They were free to starve, free to wander the woods like ghosts. As the first frost touched the windowpanes, turning the world into a landscape of silver needles, Elias realized that the stomach is the truest clock. It does not care for the sun or the stars. It only counts the seconds until the next bit of bitterness is consumed. And as the candle finally sputtered out, the scent of the dying wick reminded him of the tallow, the fat of an animal, the luxury of light, and the terrible, beautiful fragility of a life sustained by nothing but hope and crushed acorns. The candle burned out long ago, and now I write by the pale, cold light reflected from the snow outside. If the autumn was a slow decay of the spirit, then the winter of 1315 was a brittle, crystalline silence. To understand the medieval winter is to understand that heat was a currency more valuable than gold, and that the stomach's cry becomes a hollow echo in a frozen world. By the feast of St. Nicholas, the village was buried under a shroud of white that felt less like a blessing and more like a bandage over a wound. The forest, once a larder of bitter acorns and ghostly mushrooms, had become an impenetrable fortress of ice. The earth was no longer just cracked, it was iron. It refused the spade, the plow, and the desperate fingers of those searching for a forgotten turnip. In the miller's cottage, the air was so cold it felt like a physical weight against the lungs. Elias and Catherine lived in a small circle of survival, huddled near a hearth that consumed the very structure of their lives. They had burned the broken stools, the handles of old tools, and finally, the heavy wooden beams of the mill's secondary gears. They were burning their history to stay warm for an hour. "The wood is screaming," Catherine whispered one night, listening to the sap hiss in a piece of applewood. "It is only the air leaving the grain," Elias replied, though he too felt the poignancy of it. Every piece of wood they burned was a memory of a time when the mill turned and the world was filled with the scent of flour. Hunger in winter is a different creature than hunger in summer. In the heat, it is a sharp, acidic thing. In the cold, it is a heavy, sluggish sleepiness. The body, realizing it has no fuel to maintain its fire, begins to slow down its own clock. Elias found himself sitting for hours, staring at the frost patterns on the glass, his mind wandering through landscapes of imagined banquets. He did not dream of honey or wine, he dreamt of fat. In the Middle Ages, fat was the ultimate sign of grace. To be fat was to be blessed, to have a buffer against the cruelty of the seasons. Now, Elias understood the divinity of the pig. He thought of the lard they used to render, the way it turned from a white solid into a clear, shimmering gold. He imagined the taste of a single drop of grease on his tongue, a concentrated essence of life that could reignite the dying embers of his vitality. Without grain, without the forest's mast, they turned to the lowest of margins, the marrow and the stone. They had saved the bones of a hare Elias had snared weeks prior, dry, brittle things that looked like polished ivory. Catherine would boil these bones over and over again, until the water turned a cloudy, translucent white. It was a broth of ghosts. There was no meat, no fiber, only the faint, mineral taste of the animal's legacy. They drank it slowly, feeling the warmth spread through their chests like a false promise. "Is there anything left in the marrow?" she asked, her voice a thin thread. Elias took a heavy stone and cracked the bone. Inside was a tiny sliver of fatty tissue, a dark, rich secret that the bone had kept even in death. He scraped it out with a splinter of wood and held it to her lips. It was a communion of the desperate, a tiny, greasy miracle that tasted of survival. In such times, the concept of freedom becomes a mockery. One is free only to choose which part of one's dignity to shed first. To stay alive, the villagers began to consume the things that defined them as civilized beings. They ate the leather of their saddles, boiling the hide until the tannins and oils made a thick, gelatinous glue. It was a food that tasted of old stables and sweat, but it provided a momentary thickness in the gut. Elias walked out into the village square one morning. The silence was absolute. There were no dogs barking, they had disappeared weeks ago. There were no birds in the sky. The world was a monochrome of gray and white. He saw a neighbor, a man named Galtier, standing by the well. Galtier was holding a small bowl of snow, letting it melt in his mouth. "The water is the only thing that is free," Galtier said, his eyes unfocused. "But it only makes the emptiness feel colder." Elias realized then that the greatest fear was not death, but the loss of the human within the man. As the belly emptied, the virtues of charity and patience were the first to evaporate. People guarded their meager fires with hatchets. The communion they had once found in the parish church was gone. The church was now a cold stone box where the wind whistled through the rafters like a morning choir. Yet, even in this isolation, there was a strange, bitter beauty. The frost on the trees created a cathedral of lace that no mason could ever replicate. The stars at night were so bright they seemed to pierce the very fabric of the soul. Elias looked at the heavens and felt a sense of profound insignificance. Time, the stars, the seasons, these were the true masters. Man was merely a flicker of tallow in a vast, dark room. He returned to the cottage, carrying an armful of dry brambles. Catherine was sitting by the hearth, her hands tucked into her sleeves. She looked like a carving of a saint, her skin translucent, her spirit visible just beneath the surface. "I found a branch of hawthorn," he said, showing her the red berries, shriveled and frozen. They were hunger bread, the last resort of the birds and the desperate. They ate the berries together, the skins tough and the seeds bitter. It was a meal of thorns. But as the juice stained their lips a dull, bruised red, Elias felt a surge of defiant love. They were still here. They were still breathing. They were the architects of their own endurance, building a life out of the margins of the world. As the moon rose over the white silence of the Ardennes, casting a cold, blue light across the floor, Elias realized that the soul does not need much to survive. It needs only a witness. And in the dark of that frozen winter, they were witnesses to each other, two flickers of warmth in a world of ice. The ice has begun to weep, turning the world into a gray slurry of slush and mud. I write this as the drip 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 of the eaves provides a metronome for a village that is slowly waking from its frozen sleep. But do not mistake the thaw for mercy. In the year of our Lord 1316, the spring was not a rebirth, it was a hungry, hollow ghost. The transition from winter to spring in the medieval world was the most dangerous time of all. The granaries were not just empty, they were swept clean of even the dust. The livestock that had survived the frost were walking skeletons, their ribs pushing against hides that looked like stretched parchment. For the people of the Ardennes, this was the hunger gap, the cruel bridge between the end of the winter stores and the first harvest that was still months away. Elias stood in the doorway of his mill, watching the river Meuse churn with the debris of the thaw. The water was high and brown, carrying the broken limbs of trees and the carcasses of animals that had succumbed to the cold. The wheel of the mill remained still, a silent witness to the lack of grain. "The earth is soft again," Catherine said, standing behind him. Her face was pale, her eyes large and dark in her thin face. "But it offers nothing but mud." They went out into the fields, not to plant, for they had no seed, but to scavenge. This was the season of the green hunger. They looked for the first signs of life pushing through the thawing mud. They gathered wild garlic, its scent sharp and pungent, a shock to senses that had known only the smell of wood smoke and old leather for months. They sought out the roots of the dandelion and the burdock, digging into the cold, wet earth with broken fingernails. To eat a root is to eat the very patience of the earth. These were tough, fibrous things that required hours of boiling to become even remotely soft. The taste was earthy and bitter, a reminder that they were consuming the foundations of the world. They added nettles and chickweed to their pot, making a thin, bright green broth that felt like a mockery of the lush summers they once knew. "We are eating the lawn of the Lord," Elias remarked as he swallowed the gritty soup. "At least it is living," Catherine replied. In this period of isolation, the villagers' relationship with the divine underwent a strange transformation. The formal prayers of the church felt distant, like songs from a country they no longer inhabited. Instead, their faith became tied to the soil. They watched the sky for rain, not out of a desire for a bountiful harvest, but out of a desperate need for the grass to grow faster so they might eat it. Elias found himself thinking about the nature of time. To the wealthy, time was a series of celebrations, feasts, hunts, and courtly love. To the starving, time was a heavy, viscous liquid. It did not flow, it pooled. Every hour spent searching for a handful of wild leeks felt like an eternity. He realized that freedom was not the absence of a master, but the presence of a choice. And they had no choice but to follow the dictates of the emerging green. The village grew smaller as the spring deepened. The elderly and the very young were the first to slip away, their spirits departing as quietly as the melting snow. The bells of the church rang frequently now, a somber, hollow sound that echoed through the valley. Death was no longer a stranger, it was a neighbor who had moved in and refused to leave. One afternoon, Elias found a patch of wild sorrel near the edge of the woods. Its leaves were small and heart-shaped, tasting of lemon and sharp iron. It was a burst of flavor that brought tears to his eyes. It was a reminder that the world could still produce something that wasn't bitter or wooden. For a few minutes, as he chewed the tart leaves, he felt a flicker of the man he used to be, the man who loved the taste of a crisp apple and the cold bite of ale. But the false green was a deceptive period. The body, weakened by months of winter, often could not handle the sudden influx of raw, wild plants. Many fell ill, their stomachs cramping from the sudden change in diet. The very things they sought for life became, in their weakened state, a source of further suffering. Elias sat by the hearth, watching the small fire he had built from wet twigs. The smoke was thick and acrid, filling the room with a gray haze. He looked at Catherine, who was painstakingly sewing a patch onto his worn tunic. Her movements were slow and deliberate, a testament to the economy of energy that governed their every action. "Do you think the wheat will ever come back?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The earth remembers how to grow it," Elias said, though he felt a pang of doubt. "The question is whether we will be here to see it." The history of humanity is often written as a series of triumphs, of great battles and grand cathedrals. But the truest history is written in the endurance of those who survived the hunger gap. It is a story of roots and weeds, of the patience of the spirit when the flesh is failing. As the sun set, casting a long, pale yellow light over the muddy fields, Elias realized that they were like the seeds themselves, buried in the dark, waiting for a warmth they could not yet feel, sustained by nothing but the stubborn, silent will to exist. "The quill feels heavy in my hand today, for the air itself has grown thick and stagnant. I write this as a warm, humid haze settles over the valley, a season that should be a time of abundance but instead feels like a long, breathless vigil. In the year of our Lord 1316, the summer was a test of the soul's ability to endure the slowest of tortures, the sight of growth that cannot yet be eaten. By the feast of St. John, the fields had turned a vibrant, mocking green. After the hunger gap of the spring, the world was suddenly teeming with life. Tall grasses waved in the wind, and the young stalks of rye and wheat began to rise from the mud. But for the villagers of the Ardennes, this beauty was a cruelty. You cannot eat a promise. The grain was still milky and soft, its energy locked away in a form the human stomach could not yet claim. Elias walked the edge of the communal field, his hand brushing against the heads of the rye. They were thin and sparse, but they were there. He felt like a man standing before a locked treasury, holding no key. To pick the grain now would be to destroy the future for the sake of a moment's relief. "It is the longest wait," Catherine said as they sat on the bench outside their cottage. The sun was a dull copper disk in the sky, baking the earth into a hard crust. The world is full of food that is not yet food. This was the season of the long patience. Their diet had shifted from the bitter roots of spring to the meager offerings of the summer garden and the hedgerow. They ate pea pods before the peas had filled them, chewing the tough, stringy skins for a hint of sweetness. They gathered wild strawberries, tiny, intense jewels that provided a fleeting spark of joy but no real substance. They also turned to the river. Elias spent his afternoons fashioned with a primitive weir, hoping to catch the small, bony fish that moved through the sluggish currents of the Meuse. When he was successful, they would boil the fish whole, scales and all, to ensure not a single drop of nutrient was lost. The smell of boiling fish became the scent of their summer, a sharp, watery aroma that lingered in their clothes and their hair. In this heat, the isolation felt different. In winter, it was a huddle against the cold; in summer, it was a heavy, lethargic separation. The villagers moved like ghosts through the tall grass, their skin darkened by the sun but their frames still skeletal. The energy required to speak seemed too great. They communicated in nods and weary gestures, a silent pact of endurance. Elias found himself contemplating the nature of hope. Hope, he realized, was a dangerous fuel. It burned hot and fast, and when it ran out, it left a deeper darkness behind. He preferred the steady, cold iron of resolve. He did not hope for the harvest, he simply waited for it, as the stone waits for the rain. He understood that freedom was perhaps the ability to remain unchanged by one's circumstances, to be the miller even when there is no grain to mill. The village was plagued by a strange, summer sickness, the fire of the blood. Weakened by a year of deprivation, many succumbed to fevers that burned through their bodies in a matter of days. The sound of the church bell had become a constant companion, its tolling a reminder of the price of the wait. One evening, a traveler passed through the village. He was a friar, his brown robes dusty and torn. He carried nothing but a staff and a small leather pouch. He sat with Elias and Catherine for a while, sharing their watery fish broth without complaint. "I have seen the same hunger in the south," the friar said, his voice surprisingly deep. "The whole world is waiting. It is as if the earth is holding its breath." "And what happens when it exhales?" Catherine asked. "Then we shall see if we are wheat or if we are chaff," the friar replied. "Faith is not the belief that the harvest will come. It is the strength to wait for it, regardless of the outcome." As the friar departed into the twilight, Elias looked at the fields again. The rye was beginning to turn a pale, ghostly gold. The transition from life to sustenance was almost complete. But the hunger was at its most acute now, a physical presence that lived in his joints and behind his eyes. He thought of the bread they would eventually bake, the smell of it filling the cottage, the warmth of the loaf against his palms. It was a thought that could break a man if he held on to it too tightly. He pushed it away and focused instead on the rhythmic sound of the crickets in the grass. The history of that summer was not found in the chronicles of kings, but in the silent, stubborn hearts of those who refused to die while the grain was ripening. It was a story of the sun, the dust, and the terrible, beautiful discipline of the empty bowl. As the moon rose, large and amber, over the Ardennes, Elias realized that they had been stripped of everything but their essence. They were the survivors of the weight, the watchers of the gold, two souls bound together by a shared silence and a single, ripening field. The candle has burned down to a small, pooling lake of wax, and the air in this room is finally cool. I write the final words of this chronicle as the harvest of 1316 draws to a close. If the previous seasons were a descent into the depths of human endurance, then this final act is about the bittersweet return to the world of the living. It is a story of how we remember what it means to be whole. By the Feast of the Assumption, the fields of the Ardennes had finally surrendered their secret. The pale, ghostly gold of the stalks had deepened into a rich, burnished bronze. The milky stage was gone, the grain was hard, dry, and ready for the sickle. The silence of the village was broken not by the tolling of the church bell, but by the rhythmic, sweeping sound of metal through straw. Elias stood in the center of his mill, which he had spent days cleaning of cobwebs and dust. The river Meuse, now steady and calm, pushed against the wheel with a renewed purpose. When the first sack of new rye was brought to him, his hands trembled as he untied the twine. He plunged his arms into the grain, feeling the cool, sliding weight of it against his skin. It was the heaviest, most beautiful thing he had ever touched. "It smells of the sun," Catherine said, standing in the doorway, a light in her eyes that had been absent for over a year. The first grinding was a sacred event. As the heavy stones began to groan and turn, a fine, pale cloud of flour began to rise, coating the rafters and Elias's beard in a silver dust. The scent was overwhelming, yeasty, nutty, and profoundly alive. It was the scent of a world restored. That evening, they did not make pottage. They did not boil roots or bones. Catherine took the fresh flour, mixed it with water and a small bit of leaven she had kept alive through the dark months, and kneaded the dough. She did it slowly, her hands remembering the ancient geometry of the loaf. As the bread baked in the communal oven, the aroma drifted through the village tracks like a physical embrace. It was a smell that could wake the dead. When they finally sat down to eat, the silence was different. It was no longer the silence of isolation, but the silence of reverence. Elias broke the crust. The sound was a sharp, joyful snap. The bread was dark and dense, still steaming from the heat of the oven. The first bite was a shock to the senses. It was more than flavor, it was a reclamation of their humanity. As the warmth of the grain hit his tongue, Elias felt the long, cold hallway of the last year finally come to an end. They ate slowly, savoring the salt they had finally been able to trade for, and the simple, honest strength of the rye. "We survived," Catherine whispered, her voice steady now. "We endured," Elias corrected gently. "Survival is what the animals do. To endure is to remember who you are while you are doing it." But the victory was a heavy one. The village was thinner now, many benches in the church stood empty. The memory of the empty bowl would not leave them. It would become a part of their architecture, a shadow that lived in the corners of their joy. They had learned that the line between civilization and the wild is as thin as a single failed harvest. They had learned that freedom is a fragile thing, easily traded for a handful of acorns. As I look at the fields now, the stubble of the harvest reflecting the silver light of a harvest moon, I realize that the history of man is not found in the grand declarations of kings, but in the quiet resilience of those who can face the void and still choose to bake bread. Time will move on. The mill wheel will continue to turn, and the memory of the Great Famine will eventually fade into a story told by old men by the fire. But for Elias and Catherine, every loaf of bread would henceforth be a miracle. Every meal would be a prayer. The candle gutters and dies, leaving me in the soft, blue dark. The story is finished. It ends as all stories of the earth must, with the turning of the seasons, the resilience of the root, and the quiet, beautiful dignity of a full bowl.
Like and subscribe to this channel for more interesting stories.